This episode of Mr. Hutchings History is now streaming on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, YouTube, and all your favorite platforms like Castbox, Podcast Addict, and Amazon Music. Tune in now.
Welcome to Mr. Hutchings History, where the past comes alive. Let's dive into today's story.
Hey everyone, and welcome back for another deep dive. Today we're going to be exploring how World War II completely transformed the lives of Chinese Americans.
Yeah, it's a really fascinating story, and we've got a really insightful history podcast episode that's going to help us unpack it all.
Yeah, and get this. Before the war, Chinese Americans faced intense discrimination. But World War II kind of flipped the script, opening doors to economic advancement, political rights, even military service.
It really reshaped their place in American society.
Totally. Okay, so to kick things off, can you give us some historical context? Like, what was life actually like for Chinese Americans before the war?
Sure. So you really can't talk about this period without mentioning the Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882.
Right, the Exclusion Act.
Yeah, and it was this act that created what historians call a bachelor society.
Bachelor society.
Basically, because of the act, Chinese immigrants couldn't bring their families to the U.S.
So they were separated from their loved ones.
Totally isolated. And with very limited opportunities, many of them were forced into, low-wage jobs like cooks or laundry workers or garment factories.
Oh, wow. So not only were they separated from their families, but they were also kind of relegated to the margins of the economy.
Exactly. And this created these ethnic enclaves where Chinese Americans were largely confined, facing constant prejudice and with very little access to mainstream American life.
That's a really tough situation. And then, boom, Pearl Harbor happens.
Right. Everything changes when the U.S. enters the war.
Everything shifts.
It was a dramatic shift. Suddenly, Chinese Americans were seen as valuable allies.
Makes sense considering China was fighting alongside the U.S. against Japan.
Exactly. And this had a huge impact on their lives. For one thing, the wartime economy created this massive labor shortage. And you had industries that were once closed off to them.
Now they needed workers, right?
Desperate for workers. Shipyards, aircraft factories, you name it. They needed all the help they could get.
I read that by 1943, something like 15% of shipyard workers in the San Francisco Bay Area were Chinese.
That's a huge jump. It really highlights how important they were to the war effort.
Absolutely. And it wasn't just about the jobs, right? They were actively supporting the war in other ways.
Definitely. They raised funds for the Red Cross, bought war bonds, really going above and beyond to show their commitment.
Yeah, I found this stat. In 1942 alone, the Chinese community in San Francisco raised $18,000 for the Red Cross and bought $30,000 worth of war bonds. That's a serious contribution, especially back then.
It's a really powerful statement about their loyalty and their desire to be seen as Americans despite facing continued discrimination.
So it's like their actions were forcing America to rethink its stance on Chinese Americans.
And that leads us to a really pivotal moment, the repeal of the Chinese Exclusion Act.
Ah, so the war kind of forced America's hand.
Yeah, in a way. With China now a key ally, the U.S. couldn't justify keeping this discriminatory law in place.
It just didn't make sense anymore.
Right. And in 1943, President Roosevelt pushed Congress to repeal it. And they did. It was a landmark victory for the Chinese American community.
To finally be recognized as citizens after decades of being denied that, right?
Exactly. It opened pathways to citizenship and gave them a voice in the political process.
Yeah, it must have been incredible. But they didn't stop there.
Right.
They wanted to do more to prove their loyalty.
You're talking about military service, right?
Yeah.
And it's amazing how many Chinese Americans enlisted to fight for their country.
I read that 22% of all Chinese men living in the U.S. joined the armed forces.
That's over 13,000 individuals, and they were driven by this strong desire to prove their loyalty and commitment.
So where did they serve during the war?
All over. The majority were in the U.S. Army, fighting in major divisions in both the European and Pacific theaters. They saw combat in some of the most intense battles, and their contributions weren't limited to just the Army either.
So they were really putting their lives on the line.
Absolutely. There's even the story of Sergeant Thomas Fong, who earned an air medal for his service in the Bomber Corps over Europe. He was flying missions deep into enemy territory.
That's incredible bravery. So what do you think were the main driving forces behind this huge transformation for Chinese Americans during World War II?
Well, I think there are two key factors at play. First, you have China's role as a vital ally. It forced the U.S. to confront its own discriminatory policies. And second, the wartime labor shortage meant that industries had to reconsider who they were willing to hire.
It's like a combination of strategy and necessity really pushed things forward. But how do historians view this period? Is there a consensus on the impact of the war on the Chinese American community?
Interestingly enough, there isn't one single view. There are actually four main schools of thought when it comes to interpreting this period and its lasting effects.
Oh, that's interesting. What are those different perspectives?
Well, first you have the traditionalist school. They see World War II as a turning point for the integration of Chinese Americans into mainstream society.
Makes sense. It was a period of massive change.
Then there's the revisionist school. They acknowledge some progress, but they argue that the gains made during the war were pretty limited. Discrimination continued in lots of ways.
So more cautious approach. What's the next one?
The social history approach. They focus on the everyday lives and experiences of Chinese Americans during the war, those personal stories and struggles behind the big events.
Getting into the nitty-gritty of what life was actually like.
Exactly. And finally, there's the post-revisionist view. They try to strike a balance between recognizing the real progress made during the war and acknowledging that the fight for equality was far from over.
So a more nuanced view that takes everything into account.
It shows that history is rarely simple or straightforward, and that's something we'll delve into further in our next deep dive.
Looking forward to it.
Yeah, it really makes you think about how serving in the war, did it change how Chinese Americans saw themselves as Americans?
It's a good question. Maybe it created this tension between wanting to belong and still facing all this discrimination.
Totally. It's not like just serving in the military meant you were suddenly accepted.
Right. Even after proving their loyalty on the battlefield.
They come home and the prejudice is still there.
Yeah. It's tough to imagine. Risking your life for your country and then still facing those barriers.
And it makes you wonder if all of these wartime experiences, maybe they played a part in the civil rights movement later on.
Oh, that's interesting. You're saying the seeds of the movement were planted during World War II.
It's possible, right? You have this whole generation who served, they saw what racial ideology led to in Nazi Germany, and then they come home and still face discrimination.
Right. It's like a wake-up call in a way.
Yeah, and that experience could have definitely been a factor in pushing for equal rights, for challenging systemic racism.
So it's like that saying, no progress without struggle.
Exactly. And for Chinese Americans, World War II was a major turning point in their fight for equality, even if it didn't solve everything overnight.
Right. We were talking about the different schools of thought among historians about the impact of the war. And you mentioned a social history approach. What's that all about?
Well, the social history perspective, it's really focused on the everyday lives of individuals.
So it's less about the laws and more about how those laws impacted people.
Exactly. Instead of just looking at the repeal of the Exclusion Act, social historians would want to know how that affected families. Remember, for years, Chinese families were separated because of that law.
Right, and now they could finally reunite.
And social historians would also look at, the second generation, those born in the U.S. to Chinese immigrants. How are their lives shaped by all of this?
Right, like a domino effect.
Exactly. And those effects went beyond families. They reached the whole community, like the rise of Chinese American activism during and after the war.
Oh, like what kind of activism?
Well, for example, Chinese American communities organized war bond drives all over the country.
And that was a big deal back then.
Huge. They raised tons of money for the war effort, And it wasn't just about supporting the war itself.
It was a way to show their patriotism.
Right. To say, hey, we're here, we're Americans, and we're doing our part.
And that probably helped shift public perception, too.
Definitely. And it laid the groundwork for more activism around civil rights and social justice. In a way, the war gave Chinese Americans a platform to speak out and demand to be heard.
So you have this global conflict that ends up sparking social change at home.
Exactly. It's all connected.
And it reminds us that history isn't just about, memorizing dates and battles.
It's about people, their stories, their struggles, their hopes.
And those stories can teach us so much.
Yeah.
Okay, you also mentioned a fourth historical perspective, the post-revisionist view. How do they see things?
So the post-revisionists, they try to provide a really balanced view of this period. They acknowledge the progress that was made.
Like the repeal of the Exclusion Acts and the economic opportunities.
Exactly, and the incredible service of Chinese Americans in the military.
But they also recognize that there was still a long way to go.
Totally. It's not like discrimination just disappeared. They emphasize how prejudice persisted, and how Chinese Americans continued to fight for their rights.
So it's like acknowledging the victories, but also the ongoing struggles.
Right. It's recognizing that history is complicated. It's not always clear-cut.
It's messy. But by looking at it from all these different angles,
We get a richer understanding of the Chinese-American experience during World War II.
it's about seeing the full picture.
Exactly. And recognizing how much progress was made while also understanding that the fight wasn't over.
It's like looking back to understand where we are now.
And to think about where we go from here.
We've talked a lot about the laws and the policies, but it's important to remember that this is all about real people.
Absolutely. People whose lives were changed forever because of these events.
And those are the stories that really matter.
Their hopes, their struggles, their resilience.
For Chinese Americans during World War II, it's a story of overcoming incredible odds.
And it reminds us that even in the darkest of times,
The human spirit can triumph.
and the fight for justice continues.
It makes you think about what happened to those 13,000 Chinese Americans who served in the war, right?
Like, what were their lives like after they came home? Did they find acceptance?
Or did they still face discrimination? How did they rebuild their lives?
It's a reminder that the impact of war lasts a long time.
Way beyond the battlefield.
And their stories are stories that need to be told.
Yeah, it's amazing to think about how their service, their sacrifice, it just had this ripple effect that lasted for generations.
Absolutely.
So we've covered so much ground in this deep dive, starting from the challenges Chinese Americans faced before the war, all the way to, well, the dramatic shifts that happened during World War II.
Yeah.
What do you think is like the biggest takeaway from all of this? Like, what really stands out to you?
I think it's their resilience.
Their resilience.
Yeah. I mean, think about it. They faced decades of discrimination, exclusion,
Right.
but they never gave up hope.
They kept fighting for their place.
Exactly. And when the war came, they used it as a chance to prove their loyalty, contribute to America's defense, and really just fight for their rightful place in society.
Yeah, it's really inspiring. Like, no matter what obstacles they faced, they just kept pushing forward.
And it reminds us that, fighting for equality, it's not a one-time thing.
Right, it's a constant struggle.
You always have to be vigilant, always challenging injustice wherever you see it.
And the story of Chinese Americans during World War II, it's not just some historical event. It's got lessons for us today
It has.
about inclusivity, about confronting prejudice,
Yeah.
about how we can work together to make things better,
It all comes back to understanding history.
understanding history.
Yeah. We've seen how there are different perspectives on this period.
Right, different ways of looking at it.
And each perspective gives us a piece of the puzzle.
So it's like the more we learn,
The more we understand.
the better equipped we are
Yeah.
to, make sense of the present and create a better future.
Right.
This deep dive has been, honestly, really eye-opening for me.
Me too.
And I hope our listeners feel the same way.
I hope so.
It's clear that World War II was this huge turning point for Chinese Americans. It changed their relationship with America, and it set the stage for the fight for equality that continued for decades after.
It's an important story and one that deserves to be remembered.
Absolutely. And as we wrap up this episode,
Yeah?
I want to leave our listeners with a question to think about.
Okay.
How did these experiences during World War II, how did they shape the Chinese American community in the years that followed? Like, how did this generation contribute to what it means to be Chinese American in the United States today?
It's a question worth exploring.
For sure. And I hope everyone listening will continue to learn and engage with this part of American history.
It's a history filled with resilience, courage, and determination.
Yeah, determination to build a more just world for everyone.
And that's a legacy we should all celebrate and carry with us.
Well said. Thank you for joining us for this deep dive.
It is my pleasure.
And to our listeners, until next time, keep exploring, keep questioning, and keep learning.
Thanks for listening to Mr. Hutchings History. Keep exploring, and we'll see you next time.